Hello class, and welcome to your Chapter 2 lecture where we'll be discussing explaining drug use and abuse. So the learning objectives for this lesson are that by the end you should be able to list the major contributing factors responsible for addiction, list and explain 3 models used to describe addiction, list and describe the genetic, biophysiological, and reinforcement or learning theories that explain how drug use leads to abuse. Explain the 4 sociological theories known as social influence theories. Explain the differences between substance use disorders and substance-induced disorders. Explain the link between drug use and other types of deviant behaviors. And define the following concepts as they relate to drug use: primary deviance, secondary deviance, master status, and retrospective interpretation. So why is drug use more serious today? Well, first, drugs are much more potent today. So the average percent of THC in marijuana was just 1.37% back in 1978. However, it rose to nearly 19 to 34% in 2017. Most of the popular strains today average about 25% of THC. So 25% compared to 1.37% back in 1978. Media advertising can reach people faster and more often, so we're all exposed to drugs more frequently. Heroin and cocaine are so potent that they're being mixed with fentanyl and carfentanil. And carfentanil is actually used as a tranquilizing agent for elephants and other large mammals. Drug information is more widely available on the internet, so you can look up information on drugs, whether it be a licit drug or an illicit drug, if you're trying to figure out how much cocaine can I snort to not make myself die, but so that I can have a good time. You can go and find that information on the internet where you couldn't before. Drug use and drug dealing are major factors in the growth of youth crime. So membership in violent delinquent gangs is growing at alarming rates, including violent shootings, drive-by killings, and even carjackings. I can tell you specifically for juveniles in cities all across America, since COVID in 2020, there have been huge spikes, and I mean like 70 to over 100% increases in carjackings, including Philadelphia, that have happened specifically with teenagers. We don't know why. There are studies out there being conducted to figure out why that is, but that's a fact that we're dealing with right now. Another reason is that knowing harmful effects and outcomes is not deterring the drug user. So if we go back to my example earlier, even though you know that there's possibly a harmful effect of using cocaine, maybe you're going to go and use the internet to figure out how much can I use. Or, in contrast, there's a high proportion of accidents, crimes, domestic violence, relationship problems, and even early deaths that are resulting from both licit and illicit drug use. However, knowing these harmful effects is not deterring people from using these drugs, because if it were, then no one would be using drugs. So why do people take drugs? They could be searching for pleasure. We covered some of this in Chapter 1. To relieve stress or tension, especially for younger populations being peer pressured into it. Again, enhancing religious or mystical experiences. Enhancing recreational activities. So you're going to a rave or a concert. I know certain concerts, marijuana is very popular. Other types of concerts, maybe more LSD or hallucinogenic drugs are more popular to enhance that activity. They may be taken to enhance work performance. If you have deadlines to meet, if you have a lot of work on your plate and you need to get them done, it may be easy to say, let me go and use XYZ drug so that I can get through my day to improve athletic performance. So again, steroids would be in that category, to relieve pain, or to just simply escape from your thoughts and experiences. Some individuals use typically hallucinogenics, to enhance experiences, or for artistic abilities, for example, or simply to get away from those experiences. Maybe you're drinking alcohol to escape the current thoughts you have, or to escape the stress that you have. Speaking of alcohol, looking at alcohol use specifically in teens can be alarming. So we're first going to discuss binge drinking, which is categorized as having 5 or more drinks in a row. Extreme binge drinking is having 10 or 15 more drinks in a row. So in a study, teens said that they have been drunk at least one time in the following grades for the following percentages. So 12th graders reported that they were drunk 43%. Let me rephrase that. 43% of 12th graders reported that they had been drunk at least one time in their life. 10th graders reported at 26%, and 8th graders at roughly 9%. So 9% seems roughly low, but if you think about how old 8th graders are, that's a very, very young age to be drinking alcohol. I can tell you, me and my husband have had discussions as I was prepping this class, and he shared with me that he was 11 when he was drunk for the first time. 11. And he jokes that I was a bad kid, but I know his upbringing and who his family is, and I know that part of it was caused, and one of the factors that we discussed in chapter 1 was his environment, was peer pressure, was who he was around, was society. So there were numerous factors. It wasn't just, as he tries to laugh it off, as, oh, he was a bad kid. These percentages show us that generational forgetting is a real thing. So generational forgetting is when the knowledge of adverse drug consequences experienced by a particular generation or population is being lost by the younger cohorts. So these 8th graders are not learning from their older generations that you shouldn't be drunk at that age. You probably shouldn't even be that drunk when you're an adult, because you still don't make good decisions as an adult when you're drunk. But this is the idea of generational forgetting. This leads us into talking about addiction. So we're going to define addiction as a brain disorder because it involves functional changes to brain circuits that are involved in rewards, stress, and self-control. So the World Health Organization says that addiction is a state of periodic or chronic intoxication that's detrimental to the individual and society, which is characterized by an overwhelming desire to continue taking that drug and to obtain it by any means. Similarly, the National Institute on Drug Abuse says that addiction is characterized as chronic, compulsive, and at times uncontrollable drug craving, seeking, and drug use, despite the adverse physical or psychological consequences that are experienced by the drug user. So we have 2 categories that we need to discuss here when it relates to addiction: substance use disorders and substance-induced disorders. Substance use disorders is a term that's used as a diagnosable mental disorder that combines both substance abuse and substance dependence. So when an individual is dependent on that drug and they're also abusing that drug. These diagnoses can include pharmacological, which is when a person, say, is taking larger amounts of a prescribed drug over longer periods of time than is clinically necessary. Excessive time spent on obtaining that substance, having cravings, being socially impaired, risky use of the substance. So using the drug in risky situations, building up a tolerance, and experiencing withdrawal symptoms. You then have substance-induced disorders, which are a type of substance-related disorder that refers to the direct effects of the substance, including intoxication, withdrawal, or substance and medically induced mental disorders. So substance-induced disorders has also been labeled addictive disorders. There are 3 different models of addiction that we'll talk about. So we have the moral model, which is simply the belief that people abuse alcohol because they choose to do so. The disease model, however, believes addiction to be a chronic and progressive disease that a person has no control over. And this model is the one that's accepted by the United States, that's accepted by NA as well as AA, Narcotics Anonymous and Alcoholics Anonymous, that they use in their 12-step programs then. And the disease model, you actually watch a video this week that describes this in greater detail. And then you have your characterological or personality predisposition model. So this views addiction as an abnormality with the person's personality systems. It says that many addicts are also diagnosed with personality disorders, such as impulse control or sociopathy. So within this model, there's also the therapeutic community model, which grew out of the characterological model. So the therapeutic community model is actually run by addicts, and it uses harsh confrontations and time-extended sleep-depriving group encounters to break addiction. So it's just an example of one of the models that falls under the characterological model. So what are the various factors that contribute to addiction? So all of these risk factors here, these 3 categories, are going to work together to cause addiction, and not one factor alone can explain why a person becomes addicted to a drug. So if we look at biologically based factors, these ones are easier. It says that it's easier to develop a tolerance, that the person has a lack of resilience, and they're biologically based mood disorders, or a person may have a biologically based mood disorder, or they may suffer from ADHD or a learning disorder. You then look at the psychosocial and developmental category. These factors include those who have low self-esteem, those experiencing depression or post-traumatic stress disorder, repressed or unresolved grief, and having conflict in one's life. Then we look at social and the cultural environment. How available are the drugs? What are the dysfunctional family patterns that are present? Are there group norms that favor heavy drug use? And a person who feels isolated or empty. So again, all of these factors are going to work together to contribute to addiction. Not just one factor is present. So when we look at the difference between adolescents and those of middle age, there are specific risk factors that are present. So for adolescents, it typically tends to be more peer norms that favor drug use, peer pressure, just youth wanting to take risks and having a sense of invulnerability, or it being a rite of passage, or being perceived as cool, glamorous, or fun. So these are reasons why adolescents may use or may be more prone to drug addiction. Then you have middle-aged individuals. So this could be a loss of meaningful role due to retirement. So the person may become addicted to drugs because they've lost that sense of identity they had placed in their job. Loss, grief, or even isolation. Loss of positive body image. So more specifically, it would be in women, but it is present in men as well. I'm just going to use the example of women after pregnancy. They may struggle with their body image. Having a newly diagnosed illness. I can tell you the older you get, the more you start falling apart. It is true. So having a newly diagnosed illness, or not being able to lift as heavy as you once could, or having to take more breaks, you can't be as active as you once were. and even just simply disappointment with one's life achievements. I didn't get to where I thought I would be by this age. I never had a family and children, and I really wanted that. So being disappointed with where one's at in life. So you'll see that they're very different factors depending on the age of the individual that can lead them to drug addiction and drug use. When we look at the cycle of drug addiction, there's a few factors in here. So we're going to start with physiological adaptations. So this is the brain cell's tolerance and increased metabolic efficiency of the liver, which develops necessity for the user to use more to achieve the desired effect from that drug. This leads into physical dependence, which is exemplified by withdrawal symptoms that occur when the drug is not being consumed, which then leads into impaired cerebral functioning. So having impaired memory, judgment, behavior, ability to plan or problem solve, and it may even have motor coordination, which then leads into poor decision making. So this is impaired or deviant behavior or overall dysfunction, which then results in our next step of adverse social and health consequences, such as accidents, loss of earning power or relationships, having impaired health, which then causes chronic pain or depression, such as pain, low self-esteem, which can lead to an increase in drug use. And we start back all over again at the physiological adaptations. So this is the cycle that drug addiction flows in. Now we're going to discuss 3 different categories of theories that look to explain drug addiction. So we're going to look at biological theories, psychological theories, and sociological theories. So starting with biological theories use genetic theories and the disease model to explain drug addiction. It says that genetic and biophysiological theories explain addiction in terms of genetics, brain dysfunction, and biochemical patterns. So drug use has a beginning that is going to stem from physical characteristics that cause certain individuals to then experiment with or crave drugs to the point of excessive use. So the central nervous system reward sensor is more sensitive to drugs in some people, making drug using experiences more rewarding than for others. All biological theories assume substances' psychoactive effects alter one's brain chemistry. So drug abuse interferes with the functioning of neurotransmitters, leading to chemical messengers that are used, neurotransmitters are the chemical messengers that are used for communication between the various brain regions. So that's basics of what biological theories say. So we have 3 principles now, or 3 principal biological theories. The first is abuse drugs as positive reinforcers. So this theory says that drugs activate the pleasure centers in the brain, which releases dopamine that's present in those brain regions that regulate movement, emotion, cognition, motivation, and pleasure. The brain then craves these drugs when that drug is absent, and continued use of the drug exhausts dopamine systems, which leads to an inability to experience normal pleasure. So the person can only achieve that pleasure sensation when they're taking the drug. We then look at drug abuse and psychiatric disorders. So there is an overlap between drug addiction and mental illness. About 50% of those who have a mental illness actually had a substance use disorder and vice versa. The third is genetic explanations. So genetic explanations say that there are inherent traits that predispose people to become drug addicts. This is supported by increased frequency of alcoholism and drug abuse in children of addicts, even when those children have been adopted and raised by their non-alcoholic parents, and when their adoptive parents do not abuse alcohol. studies have actually shown inherited traits to be major contributors of psychiatric disorders such as schizophrenia and depression, and many of these individuals also often have substance use disorders. And finally, there's a high incidence of an abnormal gene in the cocaine abusing population that was found by one research. So these are all different supports for these genetic explanations for one to become addicted to drugs. Under those genetic explanations, we have comorbidity. So this is when two or more disorders or illnesses occur within the same person. And self-medication refers to a reliance on drugs to relieve symptoms of mental disorders. So those who have these have comorbid disorders, where they have a substance use disorder and maybe a mental health disorder, it may lead to self-medication with use of, say, alcohol. If you have anxiety and you want to relieve that anxiety, maybe they're self-medicating with alcohol. We then look at psychological theories. So psychological theories are associated with mental or emotional states that are exacerbated by social and environmental factors. These theories can be explained by escaping from reality, boredom, an inability to cope with anxiety, destructive self-indulgence, following peers blindly, self-destructiveness, and conscious and unconscious ignorance about the negative effects of drugs. So there are three major causes of addiction under psychological theories. It says that abnormality or psychopathology that manifests itself as a mental illness, or it's learning unhealthy behaviors in response to the environment, or one's thoughts and beliefs that create feelings that determine their behavior. So let's go a little deeper into psychological theories. We're going to start with substance abuse versus mental disorders. So dual diagnosis refers to when a person is diagnosed with a mental health disorder and a drug addiction. So the DSM categorizes mental diagnoses that result from using or abusing various substances. There are similarities that exist between and that coexist with substance-related mental disorders and primary psychiatric disorders, which make it very difficult to distinguish between the two. Men are more likely than women to develop a co-occurring disorder. And substance disorders have been identified by consequences of pharmacological factors, the amount of time spent obtaining the drug, whether there are cravings present, social impairment, risky use of the substance, as well as tolerance and withdrawal that present. When we look at the relationship between personality and drug use, you have introversion versus extroversion patterns that are associated with neural arousal in the brainstem circuits. So these forms of arousal are closely associated with the effects of stimulants or depressants. So introverts have fewer positive feelings and are more likely to abuse drugs, says this theory. So cocaine, alcohol, and Prozac can actually correct dopamine systems and make people more extroverted. When we look at psychological theories that are based on learning processes, the first is social learning theory, which is an association or pairing of significant reinforcing stimuli with less significant or neutral stimuli. So it says that people learn certain behavior patterns while using drugs through a process of learning known as conditioning. So habituation is one of these, which is simply repeating certain patterns of behavior until they become established or habitual. So a person may start out using drugs for pleasurable feelings or to avoid withdrawal, as they have continued using the drug over time and now have to continue using the drug so they don't experience those withdrawal symptoms, not simply because they want to experience the pleasure that comes along with using that drug. There's also sensation-seeking individuals, which are at a higher risk for drug use and addiction because of one, a preoccupation with getting high or for seeking new thrills. These sensation-seeking individuals are also often have a relentless desire to pursue physical stimulation or dangerous behaviors. Sorry, I skipped ahead. So we're now discussing addiction to pleasure theory. So addiction to pleasure theory assumes that continuing pleasure stimulus once started is biologically normal. So that it's biologically normal to continue taking a drug once you've started because it's stimulating that pleasure sensation. So when certain areas of the brain are stimulated, they produce these pleasurable feelings. Psychoactive substances will act on these brain mechanisms to produce these feelings, which then leads to pleasurable feelings being reinforced, which again drives that continued use. So this leads to the sensation-seeking individuals that I described. And then we have social psychological learning theories. So these say that how positive social influences by drug-using peers reinforce attraction to drugs as a positive reinforcer. So differential reinforcement is the ratio between favorable and unfavorable reinforcers that will sustain drug-using behavior. And use of drugs will vary with certain favorable or unfavorable reinforcing experiences. So depending on the experience you have while using a particular drug will determine whether you're going to continue using that drug or not. We then have sociological theories. So these are very similar to psychological theories. However, the focus on how factors external to the drug user how drug user affects the drug use rather than internal factors. So it views motivation for drug use as largely determined by the types and quality of bonds that the drug user has with significant others, as well as their social environment. So let's look at some sociological theories. The first is social influence theories, which focuses on the microscopic explanations that concentrate on roles that are played by the significant others and the impact they have on that individual. So in this way, when we look at social learning theory, it focuses on how drug use and abuse are learned through interaction with other drug users, as well as motivation to use drugs learned through associations with significant others in small informal groups. So it emphasizes influence on primary groups. Primary groups are those that share a high amount of intimacy and spontaneity. So these members are emotionally intertwined. You then have your secondary groups, which are segmented relationships, where the interaction is based on prescribed roles. So this could be an example of doctor and patient or teacher and student. So those are secondary groups. Primary groups are going to be your very intimate relationships, your family, your very close friends, significant others. We then look at the role of significant others in socialization. So it has been argued that mastery of criminal behavior is dependent on the frequency, duration, priority, and intensity of contact with others who engage in similar behavior. So relating this to drug users, we focus on how other drug-using members of that social group reward criminal behavior and under what conditions that deviance is perceived as important or pleasurable. Labeling theory then argues that other people's opinions that we value have a determining influence on our self-image, so that others have a greater influence than our own view of ourselves on how we portray ourselves to be. So, if those others are defining our actions as deviant, then that becomes a fact to us and we act accordingly. So deviance is simply behavior that violates societal norms or expectations. Deviance can be primary or secondary. Primary deviance is any act of initial deviant behavior where the perpetrator does not identify with deviance. So they don't identify with values and norms that violate societal's ideas of what's normal and what's valued. The secondary deviance is any type of deviance where the perpetrator does identify as a deviant. So they now themselves identify as being a deviant. And a deviant is simply defined as an individual who violates societal norms and expectations. So a deviant describes the individual. Deviance describes the behavior. So once a negative master status has been attached to an individual's public image, retrospective interpretation occurs. So, master status is our major status in the eyes of others that clearly identifies the individual. So how do others see me? How do they identify me? Do they identify me as a deviant? If that's now been attached to my public image that I'm now a deviant or I'm now a criminal, now I'm going to engage in retrospective interpretation. So this is where now I'm going to redefine my own image to align with the social stereotypes that come along with whatever that master status is that I've been given. So if I've been labeled a criminal or I've been labeled a thief, okay, well now I'm going to redefine my own image and I'm going to show you what a thief is. So this is how we see how master status and how others identify and describe and label individuals can have an effect on how that person then portrays themselves. And finally, we'll look at subculture theory, which simply says that the role of peer pressure and behavior resulting from peer group influences affects drug use. So this is particularly those that are popular or those who possess more power. So if you're in a friend group and you decide you're going to start following the head of your group because they're popular and you want to have the things that they have, or simply because you've been peer pressured by them because they have influence in that group. So when we go back to looking at drug use and deviance, it's interesting to see how you can see that deviance and the type of drugs that are used are linked. So looking at those who use illicit drugs, there's a much higher percentage that have also carried a gun or sold illegal drugs, who have stolen, who have gotten into a fight, than those who say use cigarettes or those who use alcohol. Even those who use marijuana are showing higher rates of having either sold illegal drugs or even stole than those who used alcohol or cigarettes. So these are just some interesting data to look at. So now we'll look at other sociological theories. So we look at structural influence theories. These now are going to focus on the macroscopic, not the microscopic, explanations of drug use and the assumption that organizational structures of society has a major independent impact on an individual's use of drugs. So the first is going to be social disorganization theory, which argues that because of rapid social changes in technological advancements, which disrupts cultural values and attitudes, those who previously conformed may now not feel as integrated into the community as they had once felt because of these rapid social changes. They may feel alienated, which results in feelings of disconnectedness, and they can then easily be led to deviant behavior. Social strain theory says that an inability to achieve sought-after goals is what compels some people to deviate out of frustration to achieve, in particular, financial stability. Then you have control theory. So control theory is going to emphasize the influences outside of the self as the primary cause for deviating to drug use and abuse. So socialization within control theory is defined as the process by which an individual will learn and internalize attitudes, values, and behaviors that are needed to participate in conventional society. So this theory says that people become deviant if they're left without their social controls, such as family, social groups, and organizations to hold on to. The containment theory specifically says that the socialization process will create either strong or weak internal and external control systems. So the degree of self-control, high or low frustration tolerance, having a positive or negative self-perception, successful or unsuccessful goal achievement, and resistance or adherence to deviant behavior will determine internal controls. The external control system then consists of effective and ineffective supervision and discipline, consistent or inconsistent moral training, positive and negative acceptance, as well as identity and self-worth. So these are external control systems. So drug users are then less likely to be attached to conventional parents. Students who are successful in school are less likely to use drugs. Drug users are less likely to participate in sports or organized activities. And drug users typically have friends who are going to share the same beliefs about drug use as they do. So these are all examples of how you can see these theories play out. So what are some danger signs or danger signals of drug use that we should look for? Well, the first is, do the people close to you ask about your drug use? Are you coming home and your roommate is saying, wow, you're smoking again? Oh, you're drinking again? Do you really think you need to be drinking again? Do you believe that you can't have fun without using alcohol or drugs? When you're under pressure, do you automatically go and have a drink, or do you take a drug? Do you often combine drugs and alcohol to heighten their effects? And do you drink or use drugs when you're alone? So we look at these choices of low risk and high risk drug choices. Low risk drug choices are going to be your values and attitudes that keep use of alcohol and other drugs under control. And low risk drug choices requires much more self-monitoring. So it's knowing I can have a glass of wine with dinner and that's all I'm going to have. You have your high risk drug choices then that are your values and attitudes that lead to using drugs either habitually and or addictively. So I can have a glass of wine with my dinner tonight, it's Friday night, as opposed to I'm going to have a glass of wine every night with dinner, and I'm aware that there may be some cultural differences where wine is consumed with every meal. So I'm not saying that's necessarily a high-risk drug choice. It depends on all of his other factors we talked about earlier in this lecture. The environment, the attitudes, your values, is it because your culture says that, or is it because you really just want to relax every single night after work because you're so stressed out? And high-risk drug choices are those that are going to result in emotional, psychological, and physical health problems. So again, if your culture says we have a glass of wine every night with dinner and it's not affecting any of these areas, then we're not going to consider that high-risk drug choices. Again, it's when you're using them and you're asking yourself some of these questions and maybe answering yes to some of these questions, that it could be a signal that the drug use has reached a high-risk level. So let's sum this all up. The essential feature of addiction definitions is a chronic attachment to drug use, despite the negative outcomes and consequences that come along with drug use. Major models of addiction include moral, disease, and characterological/personality predisposition models. Drug use is more serious today because of increased potency, media advertising, and drug use or dealing by violent gangs. Drugs of abuse will interfere with the functioning of neurotransmitters. Severe drug dependence is actually classified as a substance use disorder, and there are 4 genetic factors that can contribute to drug abuse. Those factors include psychiatric disorders, genetically sensitive, character traits, and an inability to cease use. So when we look at psychiatric disorders, many genetically determined psychiatric disorders can be relieved by drug use. Genetically sensitive, so there are high rates of addiction that result for those genetically sensitive to addictive drugs. Character traits such as insecurity and vulnerability often have a biological basis that can lead to drug abusive behavior. And an inability to cease drug use may be partially genetically determined when withdrawal effects are dominating. When we look at introversion and extroversion patterns, they're associated with levels of neural arousal and brainstem circuits. Reinforcement or learning theory argues that motivation to use or abuse drugs comes from the highs that are experienced. Social influence theories include social learning, role of significant others, labeling, and subculture theories. Primary deviance is the initial deviant act when an individual does not yet identify with the deviant behavior, whereas secondary deviance, the individual is now identifying with that deviant behavior. Internal and external controls will play a role in drug use and abuse. And when we look at low risk versus high risk drug use choices, low risk are values and attitudes that lead to controlled use. High risk are those values and attitudes that lead to habitual or addictive use. So that was your Chapter 2 lecture. I hope everyone has a wonderful week.